I didn't work on transatlantic relationships for quite some time, so I'm more of an EU foreign policy expert normally. And of course, you read about the transatlantic relationship, you follow what is happening in the US. But in the last 9 months, I spent my time in Washington, D.C. as a research fellow, and I was working on how the European Union and European member states represent themselves towards the United States. And there I realized really a lot of how important it is actually to explicitly talk about the transatlantic relationship. Also because I realized there are a lot of misperceptions on both sides. So coming from Europe, I really had a kind of a shock of how much I misunderstood US politics and the US foreign policy making until I actually was here and was able to observe. And at the same time, in conversation with my US colleagues, I also realized, well, it's very important to sometimes talk about things and have a conversation because we sometimes just don't understand each other because we misperceive each other. And that's why I'm really happy to be here and to talk to you. And also thanks very much for coming. The title that I was given is Transatlantic Links. And I was thinking very much, oh, well, it's actually quite a broad topic and how can I structure this? And I will tell you a bit of my ideas in a minute. But first I would like to actually start with a little association game. And I just handed you a sheet of paper where you have 3 different paragraphs. Okay, and you have association term 1, 2, and 3. And it will not take very long. I would just like to ask you, I will give you 3 terms, and just briefly think and write down the first 3 words that come to your mind. Okay? The first one, transatlantic links. What are your first 3 associations? The next one, European Union. What are the first 3 pictures that come to your mind? Okay, and to not give you too much time to think it over. Global challenges. Okay, everyone has 3 words. Keep the sheet for now. We will come back at different moments in the workshop. We will look of how your results actually also compare to what we see in the literature and in the public domain. When I was thinking, okay, transatlantic links, what can we do? I thought, well, what would make sense in the end to say, okay, let's assess what we see in terms of transatlantic links. What is it that we see is going on? And as I already was saying, my first 2 perceptions of the transatlantic relationship in the end that at least I experienced in Washington, D.C. was very much 2 different tensions. On the one hand, there was a lot of talk about, oh, Europe is in crisis. It's disunited, we have the economic crisis, it's in decline. So this was most of the time from the US side, very much a public perception that often came up also in discussions. And on the other side, when you look at the Europeans of how they report about the other side of the Atlantic, it's always like, oh, Washington, it's the ugly political deadlock, the US also doesn't get its budget in order, they in the end are not better than we are. So there was always this criticism. And then at the same time, we had now for some time from the European side in terms of politics, very much this idea, oh, the US is pivoting to Asia. The US is actually turning and showing us their back. They are not interested in us anymore. And I brought it a quote by Solana, who was the former High Representative, so the kind of foreign minister of the European Union, who called it really a dangerous development of losing the attention of the US towards Europe. And on the other hand, of course, the US side, and I brought you a quote from Clinton, where the government very quickly tried to communicate to the European partners, well, wait a minute, it's not that we are pivoting away from you, but actually we want to pivot with you together to Asia. We think it's an important challenge to look at, and why shouldn't we do it together? So that was very much the discourse that I experienced for the last 9 months. And I thought, okay, let's take this approximately 3 hours to figure out, okay, what's the state of the transatlantic relationship? What's the state of the transatlantic links? Especially when we look at it over time, so in the last 20 years, do we really see that the transatlantic links are in crisis? And I tried to picture that like this. Is it really that the 2 continents on both sides of the Atlantic are actually drifting apart, losing interests, and stop understanding each other? So that's more or less what I thought would be interesting for us to assess in different stages. Now, how are we going to do that? But I think it's very interesting that the terms that you mentioned, I think, are the ones that most people have in mind. when they hear transatlantic links. What I find interesting is this picture of Clinton and Ashton that was very much pushed through the media, because we had the same in Europe. I mean, and from a gender perspective, for example, I was very annoyed sometimes because it was always like, oh, the two ladies go on very well, like they are going on a shopping trip. But it was quite interesting to see of how much they use this image of having two leaders together going to the Balkans, for example. But I think it's also very interesting to actually bring this historical perspective in, and that's why I think we should actually look at the transatlantic links always a bit more in time, and that's what I want to do today, that we actually say, let's go back 20 years, 1993 to 2013. I think that's a nice time frame, because I think, at least from the European perspective, what impression I sometimes have is, well, we are too much focused on the present, and we always only see problems, like, oh, the last 3 years this and this and this happened. But for example, if you look back, I mean, I was just thinking the other day, this year, next year, it's 10 years enlargement. It's 10 years already that the European Union enlarged. And so many things developed positively. But because I think we sometimes forget this historic dimension and don't compare anymore too much, okay, actually, how much did we evolve over time? We sometimes also don't see the positive developments and only see the problems. And that's why I also thought it would actually be good to have a bit of a longer perspective. When I was thinking about these transatlantic links, I mean, the first thing, transatlantic is quite easy. Well, across the Atlantic. It's more of a geographical term. What I think was more challenging for me was to think about, okay, what does links mean? And then I realized, well, links is actually something very passive. You have two entities and they are there. And they can have links just by being there and doing things that influence the other. But it's not necessarily something that has to be very intentional or very deliberate. But I think what also your association showed, that most people, when we talk about transatlantic links, we actually mean the transatlantic relations. And I will actually use more this term because I think it shows much more this willingness in the end to establish a relationship. It shows much more this deliberate choice to engage and to talk and hopefully cooperate with each other. So that was more or less the idea that I had behind it. And then I was thinking, okay, as a political scientist, I want to define a term, let's look what the literature says. And here I used the International Encyclopedia of Political Science from 2011, and they gave us this long definition. And I will just read you the first paragraph. The term transatlantic relationship defies precise definition and has been used to refer to a variety of historical, political, cultural, social and economic interactions between polities, societies, institutions, groups and individuals in Europe and in North America. Very broad definition. And I will leave the second part for now because I will come back to that. And here I just wanted to highlight once more, okay, what is actually the interesting thing? I think the interesting thing is that we actually say, well, it's not only political, but there's historical interaction, political interaction, cultural, social, and economic interaction. So it's a very comprehensive relationship that we see emerging across the Atlantic. And I think it goes back to what Joycelyn was saying. Well, we have this economic and cultural immigration link between the continent. Because of course we can't forget we have historic ties. And I mean, I, for example, was surprised when I was in Washington of how strongly sometimes you still feel it when people talk of where they are from. As an Austrian, I have to say this is something that doesn't happen so often, that I meet someone who came from Austria. But Italy, for example, very deliberately uses also this idea of having ancestry and people with links to Italy. So we see that it's about very multidimensional. And then we see in the second paragraph, well, it depends. And we will come back to this. In security affairs, we talk very much about EU, US and NATO. In economic affairs, we talk about EU, US. And then they also say, okay, and there are some countries that we actually exclude on both sides of the Atlantic if you take the geographical term. And again, what I think is important to keep in mind, well, we also have to, if we want to assess the state of the transatlantic relationship, we shouldn't forget this is a process. It's a process. So it should go over time. We can, of course, say, well, how is it at the moment? But nevertheless, we will see it evolves and it has its ups and downs. But nevertheless, it's never that we can say, okay, this is now the end state or this is the beginning of something new, but it's always that it evolves and various different elements are played together at different times. So that's more or less the idea that I had. And just to visualize again, I thought, well, actually what we're doing, we look over time, we look at both sides of the Atlantic, and we look actually at the relationship and the content of this relationship. And the two things that I thought, at least from my perspective, would be especially interesting on to focus and to talk with you a bit more is to talk about the content dimension in the second part, but in the first part to focus a bit more on the European side and say, okay, as we saw in the definition, this terminology, the European part, is constantly switching. Why is this the case? What is there in Europe that actually in the transatlantic relationship, it depends on the policy domain, the time of whom we are talking about. So that was more or less the plan for today. As already said, let me know when it's getting too boring because you say, oh, we know that, and if you want me to move on. At the same time, I have again, time and again, some interactive elements to make sure that you're also involved and we can also talk to each other. And I hope normally we should be finished a bit earlier so then we can also raise other issues that you want to talk about because I think there are a lot of other things going on that perhaps I might not cover. Everyone okay with that? Good. Then let me start with the first one. So let's look at the European side. And again, first, I just wanted to bring you this quote. So this one that we had before. And I just want to take these three now, step by step, and look actually what do they mean. And in this definition, they say in security affairs, we see the United States and the European NATO partners. Do we know who the European NATO partners are?
Some of them. Many of them.
To make it a bit easier.
Some surprises.
Exactly.
From the American perspective, who is and who isn't. Yeah.
Whom would you say is a surprise?
Well, I guess, well, maybe it's not a surprise, but Sweden and Switzerland are not in NATO, for example.
Turkey is.
Yeah, Turkey is. And Greece.
Exactly.
Turkey's in the EU.
So what we say, we have a couple of member states, a couple of EU member states who are not NATO members. So we have my home country, Austria.
Right.
We have those two. And two that you probably don't see so much. We have Cyprus and Malta. Okay, so those are the EU member states who are not NATO members. Ah, and of course, I shouldn't forget Ireland. Very important. Ireland.
Yeah.
Okay. So these are the EU member states who are not NATO members. Three neutral ones, Ireland, Sweden, and Austria. And the others decided not to join NATO. But on the other side, we also have the reverse, that we have NATO members who are not EU members. So the orange ones. The big one, Turkey, of course. The one that soon will join the European Union. We know whom I'm talking about.
Croatia.
Yeah, exactly, Croatia.
Kosovo's up there.
Albania.
Oh, yeah, oh, well.
That's Albania. We have Iceland, and we have Norway, who are NATO members, but not part of the EU. And now you might think, well, yeah, but it's nearly overlapping. But nevertheless, of course, this disbalance creates sometimes concerns in security issues. And what is more even in security issues, the European Union over time tried to develop its own security dimension within the common security and defense policy. But it had a hard time in balancing this development, this new development, with keeping an interest in NATO. And very often we had this discussion, actually, do we need a security dimension in the EU when we have NATO? The EU members who are not in NATO were saying, of course we need. And the neutrals were saying, of course we need a security dimension in the EU, because we are not part of NATO. And on the other hand, the NATO members were saying, well, really? Do we really want to duplicate everything? What's the point? And wouldn't it be better actually to have a security arrangement where also the other part of the transatlantic relationship is in? So that's the security affairs. Let's look at economic affairs. And then the definition says, well, in economic affairs, it's the US. And what I find quite interesting, the members of the European Union. It doesn't necessarily only say the US and the European Union. but it says the US and the members of the European Union. 27 at the moment, soon 28, covering approximately 500 million people. And for a long time, this was considered the strength of the European integration project, also in external affairs. Trade, customs union, that was where the European Union had a strong stance. It also still has. But of course, what we see at the moment with the economic crisis, a lot of people start doubting if the European economy is actually strong enough to stay an important partner in economic terms. When you look at the trade numbers, or when we talk about the financial crisis, many people will say, well, it's the euro crisis, the euro is in crisis. The euro is fine. The euro as a currency in the international trading system is absolutely fine. It is a fiscal problem that we have, that the member states can't balance their budget anymore with the strong euro that we see in the international market. And there we see this discrepancy that actually in financial terms, in terms of trade, the European Union is absolutely okay. But this psychological element of how it's perceived also really hampers its reputation as an international actor. But as we see here, it's the European Union, which is quite different from the security arrangement. And then the third part of the definition, well, there are some countries excluded. And on the one hand, they mention Latin America, but on the other hand, they mention that are not members either of the European Union or NATO. And first I was thinking, well, it depends probably on your definition of Europe. Whom do you consider as Europe? Because I was like, okay, who are the European countries that are not part of the EU and NATO? Anyone comes to your mind? I give you a card. This is the card of the Council of Europe, because I thought that would be a good way of comparing it. Any idea who is there that is not in the EU or NATO?
Well, Sweden, or no? Oh, Switzerland, of course, I'm sorry.
Switzerland. Mm-hmm.
Liechtenstein?
Mm-hmm.
That are not, okay.
Let's think a bit bigger.
Oh.
Let's think a bit bigger. No offense to the Swiss.
Russia? Ukraine?
Exactly, we see the East.
Oh, well.
We see Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova. Exactly, the Southern Caucasus. And what I find quite interesting, in my definition of transatlantic relationship, I'm actually not sure that normally I would include Turkey. Of course, it's a NATO member, and in security terms, Turkey is an important member of the transatlantic community. But normally when we talk about a transatlantic relationship, at least from the European Union side, Turkey is not really considered a partner. And I find that quite interesting. Just a couple of days ago in the news, Turkey announced that they also want to be part of the negotiations on the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. They don't want the EU and the US to create a free trade union perhaps and not be part of it. And they were saying, it doesn't make sense because we are partner too of this relationship. So I find it quite interesting to see how their geographical conceptions come back and actually have a political impact. So that much, okay, I can jump over this one. That much to this formal definition. I think it helps a bit to get an idea of what the transatlantic relationship might be about. But at the same time, it's a very conservative definition because it remains very careful of whom it considers an actor. And I thought it would be interesting for this talk today to focus a bit more on the European side and especially on the European Union as a foreign policy interlocutor. So why do we actually see it? That the European Union is not able to be this international partner for the United States in a transatlantic relationship in a comprehensive manner. Security, trade, politics. Why is it actually that the definition switches between economics, security, and other policy areas? And what I, from an EU politics scholar perspective, find quite interesting is that actually this is one of the aims that EU really tries to tackle since 1993. It is more or less since 1993 that the European Union, in its revisions, time and again tries to become a more coherent, active and unitary foreign policy actor. And many people say, well, that was the Lisbon Treaty. Yes, that was the latest treaty where they tried to be more unitary. But we had it in the Amsterdam Treaty, we had it in the Maastricht Treaty, and even the Single European Act in the 80s. It was always of, let's become a more coherent, unitary and efficient foreign policy actor. At the same time, the question is, of course, why is it so difficult for the EU to achieve this thing? And many scholars say, well, it's because of its nature. Because the European Union still is this very unsolved, strange political unity that hampers how it presents itself in international relations. And then, of course, we have to ask, like, well, if the EU is not just a normal state, what is it? But in the end, what we see is, and I brought you here the definition from the CIA Effect book, something that my students love looking at instead of going to a library and looking at something else. But what you see, what the problem with the European Union, or the challenge of the European Union is that as a political system, it is neither a state, but it's also not an intergovernmental organization anymore. And then political scientists for some time had this debate like, oh, it's a unique political system. It's something very peculiar. It has never been, nothing has ever been like this, where you have member states pooling certain sovereignty, but not all. And that is this, its overarching entity is unique. It's not a federation, but it's far more than a free trade association. So it's somewhere in between. And sometimes we see tendencies where it goes in the one direction, and then again we see tendencies where it goes in the other direction. But at the same time, we also see that especially politicians in Europe try to avoid the question of, okay, what's the finality? What should be the end state? This is something, a discussion that came up a bit during the negotiations for the constitutional draft treaty, but it very quickly died down again because politicians, I think, are also sometimes a bit scared of what might come out of such a discussion. Do we really want to discuss what we want the European Union to be? Many observers then say, perhaps this is not a discussion that we should have at the moment. On the other hand, it also goes very much with the history and the development of the European integration project. Because at the beginning, with the ECSC, when they started with the Schuman Plan, they never had in mind to create a European Union. And I think it's quite interesting then to look into history and also read what the different founding fathers actually had in mind when they set up this project.
Founding fathers. So I spent a lot of my life different. There are other founding fathers. That's good to know.
Mm-hmm. But it's then quite interesting. For example, with Schuman, it was always quite interesting to see he didn't have this idea of a big political union in mind. His idea was quite different than what we saw then evolving in the 90s, for example. Perhaps another definition from the US side, that's the State Department definition. By the way, with a mistake. Anyone can find it. There's one mistake in the definition.
Where's this?
Oh, okay.
It's a blur of the colors.
1948?
Mm-hmm.
It was not founded in 1948.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Where is this?
It's in the first line. So it says the European Union was founded in 1948 in the afterworld of the World War II, promotes stability and economic cooperation, develop common institutions, and what I find quite well formulated, to legislate specific matters of joint interests. Okay, so
Legislators.
you have that here. Okay, so they are being okay. If the EU member states agree on something and they pool sovereignty together, then it is actually the EU level.
Well, yeah, it's obviously a very American perspective of which is the whole theme of our readings, of what Europe, what we think Europe is, not what Europe is.
Mm-hmm. Exactly, but that's in the end what some people say makes it a specific entity. It's a fragmented federal system. In Europe, we normally don't use this term, federalism. That's really something, it's just not healthy for the public debate. So we call it, well, it's a fragmented, pooled sovereignty political system. And just another few quotes that you often see. It's a political system sui generis, what I already said. It's something very unique. It's less than a state, but more than an international organization. a British definition, which is, I think, very careful in formulating it. The European Union is a partnership of 27 democratic countries working together for the benefit for all their citizens. Very vague. And then a political science definition I'm always laughing, because the European Union is the most complex, densely institutionalized and authoritative supranational regime in the world.
Where's Professor Marx from?
He is associated to Amsterdam and North Carolina.
UNC.
Yeah. Yeah. But, I mean, especially everyone who ever looked at the treaty will see, well, yes, it's very complex. It's densely...
Regime's a pretty strong word.
It's densely institutionalized. What I find interesting that he used authoritative.
Well, me too. That and regime, it's really pejorative.
But it also shows, okay, of course, we also then have to think about what do these terms mean. So now that we know, okay, the EU is this in-between political system, there also evolved a big debate in the 70s and 80s. Can a political system that is not a state actually have a foreign policy? And in this debate, political scientists mainly said, well, foreign policy always means a deliberate choice of what kind of objectives you want to pursue in your external relations, in your foreign policy. So in the end, you have to have clear objectives, you have to select them intentionally, and you really have to pursue them in what you do abroad. And the big debate was, well, if it's not a state, can it really have this deliberate and intentional pursuit of interests? And what kind of interest does it then pursue? The European interest? What is that? You can look in the treaties. Promotion of human rights, promotion of rule of law. Very vague definitions there of the values of Europe. But what does it mean in foreign policy? And we see this debate still going on today, which political scientists use a bit of a different terminology. Now we talk about a foreign policy strategy. The criticism being very much, well, the EU still lacks, 20 years after the Maastricht Treaty, a clear strategy of what it wants to do in foreign affairs. So that was one of the debates that I think also influenced the transatlantic relationship. Another debate that was going on, and it was mainly two British professors, Dave Allen and Mike Smith, who were saying, well, perhaps we shouldn't talk about the EU as a foreign policy actor, but perhaps the EU just has international presence. It's there, and other states react to it. But it doesn't really have this active element. It doesn't have this active capacity to actually interact with other actors. And then there are studies back and forth saying, okay, let's see how this changes over time. And the third debate that I find quite useful is also by a British professor, Chris Hill, who said, well, actually, perhaps we shouldn't talk about one EU foreign policy, but perhaps we should actually consider it more as a system of external relations. And his point was the following, because I think it is actually quite a smooth way of thinking of how the EU is an actor in the transatlantic relationship. Chris Hill was saying the system of external relations consists of three strands. The first one is just the sum of national foreign policies. So all 27 current members have their foreign policies, and since the Maastricht Treaty, they actually say they will make sure that they at least go in the same direction. Some might go a bit quicker, some might go a bit slower, but they will at least try to pursue the same objectives. The second strand, Chris Hill said, well, that's actually the traditional first pillar external relations that we had, mostly with trade and economic aspects. Trade and exclusive EU competence, meaning that this is really the area where the EU has the most impact, where we see the Commission negotiating on behalf of the European Union and its member states with their partners. It's also really the one competence that is less debated. What we see in the development of the treaties, it was quite clear, well, we have a customs union, we also need, we want a single market, we need a customs union, so then it also makes sense to have a common trade policy. What is then saw evolving over time with the treaties was, well, what is covered by trade. And there you saw this move going from goods, slowly more and more, also including services, until the Lisbon Treaty. So that's the second strand. What we also have in the second strand is development cooperation. And development cooperation is the shared competence. So we have a very strong commission administering development assistance and external assistance funds. But because it's a shared competence, it also means that each member state still has their own development policy. Of course, they try to coordinate it as well to be more efficient. But nevertheless, we have actually a dual system here. So that's the second strand. And that was the one that actually developed from the first pillar and is meant to be the external relations aspect. The question then that many political scientists were saying, well, when you enact in trade, is this actually foreign policy? Do you follow economic interests, or can you also follow political interests through your trade policy? So where is it that trade follows politics, or is politics following trade? But I think it's a very interesting debate to say, okay, if you're strong in the second strand, what does that mean for you as an international actor? And then Chris Hill said, oh yeah, we also have the third strand. And that's this common foreign and security policy that the European Union developed since the Maastricht Treaty, which was at this time the second pillar. And it was kept outside of the framework of the first pillar because it was kept intergovernmental. So the whole idea was, well, with Maastricht Treaty, we want to move on with the issues that we already had established beforehand. We want to pull sovereignty there. This was the first pillar. But then they were saying, well, we also want to cooperate more closely in foreign affairs. So let's do this in the second pillar because we don't want to pull sovereignty there. We want closer cooperation, so doing more than what we did before, but we don't want to move as far as we did with the other issues. And the big question, of course, is with the Lisbon Treaty, we officially dissolved the pillars. Nevertheless, many observers say, in terms of content, not a lot changed. We don't talk about pillars anymore, but in terms of policies, the situation remained pretty the same as it was before. So that's the system of external relations. And I think it helps us also to understand why we'd have different different partners on the European side in the transatlantic relationship. I also thought what's interesting is I'll bring you two quotes from the early 90s that are always coming up. Time and again you find them in articles, but also in newspapers. And the first one is from 1991 by the Belgian Foreign Minister. And if you remember 1991, that was the start of the Yugoslav wars. So we just had ended the Cold War. Europe felt like, yes, we are finally moving on. And then Yugoslavia happened in the end. And the Belgian Foreign Minister was saying, well, Europe is an economic giant, exclusive competence in trade. A political dwarf, we don't agree. And a military worm. Well, actually, even if we agree politically, we still can't act militarily, really. So that was in 1991. And something that you hear time and time and repeated, where people are saying, well, 20 years later, did actually something change?
So when did Kissinger say that or write that?
And then we had the second. So Kissinger apparently was saying, when I want to speak to Europe, to whom do I call? And I put a question mark there, because a year ago Kissinger gave an interview. And he was actually saying he never said that. But I think it gives you a very good anchor in saying, okay, in the transatlantic relationship on the European side, whom do you call? Who is from the US side now, who is your opponent or your partner that you should negotiate with if you want to talk in the transatlantic relationship? And from what we have heard now, well, it depends on the time. And here the treaties come in. So under the Single European Act, we had European political cooperation. It was a very loose system. So when the EU, the EEC members at this time, so the foreign ministers met of the member states, in the afternoon they were meeting in the framework of the European political cooperation just to talk of what's going on internationally, what their positions are, and if there are any disagreements. But it was a very loose system until the 90s. And then we had the Treaty of Maastricht, the treaty in the European Union, which officially established the European Union. And as I was already telling you, it established a common foreign and security policy. And in the governmental framework, each member state has a veto. Or since Amsterdam, they transformed it into constructive abstention, saying, well, perhaps you don't agree, so you don't support this thing, but perhaps you also don't strongly disagree, so you just stay neutral. So that the others go along with your decision, but you don't block it and you don't have to support it. So something that they try to circumvent this veto option that many member states had. And we see that this thing moved on. With the Treaty of Amsterdam, member states realized, yeah, we established a common foreign and security policy, but actually not a lot is happening. And if you remember, in the 90s we had first the Balkan Wars, we had Kosovo in 1999, and member states just realized, yeah, we set up this policy, but we don't have capacity, we don't have people actually working in this area. And that's why with Amsterdam they created the post of the High Representative. So what Ashton was now was Solana before, and he was the first office holder to give a face to this new policy and to this new initiative. In around 2001, they then created the Common Security and Defense Policy. And the whole idea was, well, if we cooperate in security terms, perhaps we should also talk about defense and military capacity. Until now, this is still a policy that is very much debated if it was successful. We saw from 2003 onwards some missions, some European Union missions, but at the same time, when you look at the capacity of the missions and the objectives of the missions, they're very limited, they're very small scale. It doesn't mean that they are not important, but everyone is saying, well, yeah, it works, but only on a very small scale. So the EU can't send big missions anywhere because it doesn't have the capacities. The Treaty of Nice didn't change a lot, and then we had the Treaty of Lisbon. And there again, the whole idea of let's make the EU a more coherent, more unitary, more efficient foreign policy actor. They, in the end, upgraded the post of the High Representative. So what formerly was Solana now became the post of Lady Ashton. And what's interesting is that she's actually supposed to be the bridge between what is happening in the European External Action Service, where she's chairing, what is happening in the Council, because she is the chair of the Foreign Affairs Council, where the member states meet, but she's also vice president of the Commission. So she should also have access to what the Commission is doing in its external affairs. And the whole idea is that we need one linchpin in the end to create coherent action. What we saw in the last 5 years, it sounds very nice on paper. It's a very difficult job because in the end, this one person has to fill 3 different roles. So if we want to see whom to call on the European side, well, we first have to establish what time are we talking about, especially when we talk about the European Union. It's a very legalistic entity. It always depends, and it will tell you in the treaties. Yet, it also depends on the policy area, and that brings us again back to the system of external relations. And EU nerds have this joke, well, we don't only have one president, actually we have 3. So don't always criticize the EU, actually we have more than only one. But as you can imagine, it always makes it easier. Any idea who these 3 people are? The 3 presidents? Anyone recognize this one? Exactly, we have Barroso, the president of the European Commission. Exactly, Herman van Rompuy, former Belgian prime minister and now chair of the European Council. He himself doesn't call himself a president, but he calls himself a chair of the European Council. And who is this gentleman in the middle? Exactly, it's the Irish Prime Minister. Exactly, it's the Irish Prime Minister. Why is he president?
Till today.
1 more month. We have until end of June. Exactly. He holds, his country holds the rotating presidency in the Council of Ministers. So he is representing the Council in the end, the Foreign Affairs Council of the Union. So these are the 3 presidents. Someone was saying, well, it's not Scholz. And it's true, sometimes some people even talk about 4 presidents. And the 4th one would be the president of the European Parliament. And that's quite interesting to observe how this relationship now works out, because officially, since the Lisbon Treaty, those 3 are the ones that are meant also now with the Eurozone crisis, who were asked time and again, okay, come up with proposals. And then the European Parliament was always saying, well, we also have a president, you should take him into account too. And you see, it was quite interesting to see when Scholz took the office of president, he was very, very active in filling this role and saying, wait a minute, I'm here too, and I'm a president too of an institution, so take me into account. Something where you really see how much personality matters, because the former presidents of the European Parliament were good presidents for the European Parliament, but they didn't play this external role in making sure that the European Parliament is heard. So whom do we call? When do we call whom? What would you say? When should we call Barroso?
Exclusive competences like trade.
Mm-hmm.
You call Barroso?
Exactly. You might call him, or when you want to talk to the Trade Commissioner, you might call De Gucht actually. Okay, so everything that has to do with Commission competences, or sometimes also share competence, you call the Commission. In political issues, you might actually also call Lady Ashton. So if it's something where we have an agreement of the Foreign Affairs Council, policy towards Iran, okay, there's a certain council conclusion of what the member states agree on, then actually she can act on basis of this agreement. Okay, so in this regard, you can call her. When do we call the Irish Prime Minister? No one wants to talk to the Irish.
When you plan a summit? When there's going to be a summit? When it's a shared competence and the council's involved?
Exactly. All CFSP matters where we don't have a unified position, then it's always the rotating presidency. And what's quite interesting, at the moment with the negotiations on the free trade agreement, actually, of course, the Commission is negotiating, but with the Lisbon Treaty, in terms of who is chairing the council formations in Brussels, in trade issues, it's the rotating presidency. So there you see that they had a meeting, I think 2-3 weeks ago, in Ireland, talking about economic affairs. And of course, the Commission was there and De Gucht was there, but it was also the Irish presidency who has to formally put this issue on the agenda in Brussels. Where many people saying, isn't that a bit strange that we try to centralize it now with having one Foreign Affairs Council chair, but then in trade issues we go the other way and actually give it back to the member states. It makes the system even more complicated. When do we call Van Rompuy?
We don't?
Yeah, well, why would we?
Sorry, not to insult him, but...
It very much depends on what is your level. If you are the president, you might call him or him. And most of the time they actually come both of them together. Okay? So when it's head of state and government, it should actually be the president of the European Council who is meeting them, because he's, in terms of diplomatic protocol, on the same level. Okay? When it's a minister or the foreign secretary, they are more likely to talk to the two of them. Okay? So it also then depends on diplomatic rank and political position in the end. Nevertheless, you might also have sometimes reasons to call them. Okay? And what I find quite interesting lately, especially in the transatlantic relationship, everyone talks about those three. And then I look at one of your associations that you had with the European Union, and I'm like, we had enlargement. Where's the whole rest of the European Union? That is actually east of Germany. I think that's also quite an interesting development that you see, also in political and security terms at the moment. Those three countries seem to still be considered the driving forces, the big three: Germany, France, and the UK. At the same time, within the European Union, at least in the East, you slowly get this notion that, well, what's about Poland? And you really see how the Poles try to establish themselves as sort of a regional leader in bringing positions together in the East and trying sometimes also to counterbalance the big three in the West. Okay? But nevertheless, and I think the Eurozone crisis showed it quite clearly again, we see time and again, of course, we can't forget the member states and the heads of states and government, who will remain important. Okay? Perhaps not of the smaller member states, but of the big ones.
I would call Draghi.
Why?
Well, because of the crisis, and he will do whatever he can.
We all know who Draghi is. Exactly, he's the president of the European Central Bank. Can he do a lot?
Well, that's a whole field. I mean, it was partly cynical, but partly not. No, because this would get us into the whole question: what is the function of a European Central Bank, and where are the limits? But I don't want to sidetrack.
I mean, at the same time, you saw that, especially, I think it was more last year or the last 2 years, that he was also a central figure in terms of saying, well, the Germans and the French don't agree, and the British talk about leaving anyway. Okay, there's at least someone, at least in the public discourse, it was very strongly. Draghi was presented as, oh, okay, we don't know him. No one has heard about him before. We are not sure, the public is not sure what the European Central Bank is doing, but he seems to have ideas. And at least he tries to do something. I think that was really interesting to see of how he was represented as the expert, as the one who can at least try to fix the Eurozone.
Not to fix, but to calm the market.
Exactly, yeah. No. So the thing is, if we want to talk to Europe, it's a very complex picture. And it really depends. It depends on the time, it depends on the policy area, it depends on your political level. And the thing is, I mean, in Maastricht I'm teaching European studies. So all we do for 3 years in the end makes students understand this kind of system. But of course, we can ask ourselves, can we expect from a partner in the transatlantic relationship like the US to actually understand the European Union and also be patient for these varying interlocutors that you're seeing? And that is more or less this one text that I gave you as reading for the preparation by Spragia, where she makes the point, well, the EU lacks external sovereignty. It doesn't have the same standing like the US, and it will never have, probably. Because it lacks military power, and this is something we'll come back later, something that you still, again, hear very strongly. Well, the EU still didn't manage, the European member states still didn't manage to actually get their military capacity in order. It lacks authority. In some areas, the European Union can make decisions, but in many it can't, but it's the member states. And it lacks unitary voice. And just beginning of the week, no, last weekend, the Foreign Affairs Council was discussing Syria. Should we prolong the European embargo on Syria? And the only thing that member states again agreed on was, well, we actually don't. And we didn't have a conclusion. And that's a picture that time and again you see in the media. Well, we don't have a unitary voice because sometimes we don't agree. What I think is a totally different discussion than is, well, is this good or bad? Perhaps sometimes we have sovereign states, they don't agree to act together. If you come from an intergovernmental perspective, that's legitimate, and that's also not a problem. The second argument that Spragia made was, well, in this regard, actually the European Union is a mirror image of the US. And I think it's a very interesting concept to work with, because she's saying, well, actually, in internal politics, states in the US are very strong. Something that I learned in the last 9 months. I was quite surprised also, for example, in market terms, that states have a very strong say in regulatory policies, in import policies, and this kind of things. What's quite reverse in the European Union, customs union, states don't have a say anymore. Economic politics, states don't have a say anymore. But in external affairs, where the US has, or the US government has a strong role, the EU government, so the federal level, or the supranational level, if you call it in European terms, doesn't have this role. And Spragia then says, well, actually what we see is two responses, depending on how you want to perceive the European Union. On the one hand, you see this response like, oh my God, if you think that the EU should be a federal system, why is Europe so disunited? So why actually can't they have one common foreign policy? Or if you're coming more from the national or intergovernmental perspective, you're actually asking, yeah, why do we actually see member states working so closely together? Why do they pool sovereignty? If you're a sovereign state, why would you give away your power? And her argument is, well, understanding this mirror image is very important, as otherwise you will always be disappointed in the transatlantic relationship. Okay? Yeah.
And I mean, I guess my question would be, if you have this situation, then something like the trade agreement is even harder to come by, because you have states that are strong in economic terms in the US for things like regulation. All of that's handled at the EU level. So there might be a shift in who is represented, like at the negotiating table, no? In a sense.
Well, I'll come back to this in the second part as well. Because what they did since 1995 is that they also tried to bring regulators more together. And the big problem was it depended on policy area, on what level it was in the EU and the US. So they really had to check in each single small area who actually has the competence. And in regulatory policies, that makes it very complicated at some point. And I mean, we will talk probably a bit more also about the free trade agreement at the end, but one big concern from the European side is procurement in the US. The European procurement, state procurement. So giving national contracts to firms. That is on the state level in the US, and where there are some states that don't allow foreign companies to actually bid. Where the European Union is saying, well, you know, we have a common procurement system, you should have one too. I was looking at the EU-US summits and what more or less the common topics are. And my impression was exactly they did this kind of exercise in 5 minutes, just sitting there, throwing everything together and saying, oh yeah, this is our agenda now of the transatlantic relationship. And we'll see, we'll come back to this afterwards. Because I think most of the things that you mentioned actually come back in the transatlantic relationship. And what I find interesting there is that it's exactly on these very vague terms. Yeah, we want to work on ecological issues, on climate change. We have to do something with conflict resolution, terrorism after 9/11, of course, being a big topic. But it remains most of the time on this very vague level. And many people say it actually remains like a shopping list. They just list everything that comes to their mind in a short period of time and say, this is our agenda. And that's, I think, also one of the criticisms that we have with the transatlantic relationship on the political level at the moment. We do too much and nothing at the same time. What I want to do in the second part is in the end look a bit more at this content dimension. So we were looking now very much at Europe, at the European side beforehand. In the end concluding what we see on the European side is that we have different actors involved, different layers, different interlocutors, and it depends in which policy area, at what time, who are actually the people, the politicians, the roles that are the important partners for the US in the transatlantic relationship. But in the next hour or so, I want to spend a bit more time on this. What kind of link did they create and how did they fill it with content? And again, what I think is important to see this whole thing in a time dimension as a process over approximately 20 years. The first thing I was surprised at was like, okay, when they established the transatlantic relationship, I mean, of course we had single member states having relations with the US for decades. But in terms of a transatlantic relationship between the European Union and the US, the first document is from 1990. And I was surprised, it was really? That's not such a long time ago. 1990 was the first document where they actually set up and said, okay, let's institutionalize our partnership. And actually also say what we want to do. I think the first important thing that we have to remember, it's 1990. It's just after the fall of the Iron Curtain, of the fall of the wall in the end, and the end of communism. And I mean, as the whole document also, when you compare it also to later documents, it really has a very idealistic, oh, we can breathe again, you know? Oh my God, something happened now, let's reorientate. And looking towards each other, so what are we doing now? But at the same time, what you also see, well, they point out some goals, but these goals are very vague. It's just like, okay, what is it? We now have no agenda. We have to think again now that we don't have a common enemy again, what is it actually that we want to do together? And in this document, very vaguely, they outline these 4 goals, more or less. So they talk about the support of democracy, rule of law, but again, very vaguely. Safeguard peace and promote international security. And what I found quite interesting, reinforce the role of the UN. So that was still a time where we believed in international institutions, where it was really like, okay, let's together believe in multilateral negotiations in international institutions. Let's strengthen the United Nations and create this multilateral system after we end bipolarity. And then the third thing, and I think you made a very good comment, sound world economy. So strong growth, low inflation for international stability. And what I think is quite interesting here is that on the one hand, it's of course the signaling against communist way of making economy. So free trade in the end as this one objective. But at the same time,
no mention of poverty.
on the one hand, but at the same time you see this, and that's why I put it there, sound world, it should be world economy by the way, sorry. So sound world
That's
economy
interesting too.
for international stability. And I think this is also something interesting you very often see in documents. It's, well, our main interest is stability, okay? And if we can achieve this through prosperity and sound financial means, that's good. But our goal is not that others have a better life. Our goal is that it's a stable world.
Status quo.
And what I found interesting in your comments about Latin America, something that also you see in the current negotiation on the free trade agreement with the US, people always pretend that the European Union is very protectionist and that the Commission is really there to protect rights and really come up with protective measures. And it's true to a certain extent because we have a very strong social security sector in many European member states. But for a long time, the Commission was seen as the guiding figure into liberalization. That was one of the criticisms that we had in Europe against the Commission's idea of how to design an economy, liberalization. And that's something I think that sometimes when, at least at the current negotiations, sometimes I'm like, but the Commission normally in their logic, they are not protectionists. They never were. They have always had this liberal market idea. And I think that was a very interesting comment. At the same time, the document is very vague. We will consult each other, we will talk to each other. And we will seek close cooperation in international bodies. So then just saying, okay, we'll work together. What I find an interesting observation from Glenn was also like, well, there's this talk of, we know how to run an economy and we'll now show the world. And there this idea from 2008 comes back. Now with the financial crisis, this is really something you couldn't put into documents anymore because people would laugh at such documents. That's, of course, the psychological element of the financial crisis, where we'll see how this plays out. So that was 1990, very vague, and I call it this first stage. In the end, realizing, the enemy is gone, this whole focus of keeping the communist way, in the end, drops from your shoulders. You don't have this weight anymore. And now suddenly you have to look for new tasks. And they also do this in the transatlantic relationship. And it actually only takes 5 years until they start refining the partnership. And it was in 1995 where they came up with a new document called the New Transatlantic Agenda, which is quite longer than this first document. It's also way more specific. 1995, though, we have to keep certain things in mind. On the one hand, again, the Balkan Wars, 1991 to 1995. So we had this experience, communism was gone, Europe free, we have new energy in the end to tackle new things, and then Yugoslavia dissolves. And again, actually, we have war on the continent. So there was this backlash. And at the same time, you saw in 1995 was like, we not took care of it. We were not happy how it went, but now we managed, now let's move on. So that was on the one hand the geostrategic perspective. On the other hand, 1995 was 2 years after the Maastricht Treaty. So now we talk about the European Union for the first time. And you also see there that there was a strong urge from the European side to actually give a certain power, a certain position to this new body, to in the end enable also the institutions to play a role in the transatlantic relationship. So on the one hand, we had, of course, this new mindset. And we had the European Union now as an actor. And again, they, in the end, outlined these 4 goals. And I think they very much, at least the first three, represent also what we were coming up if you would have to put your associations into boxes. Promote peace, stability, and democracy. And then they mention certain regional problem zones. Yugoslavia, Central and Eastern Europe, saying, okay, we have these new countries now evolving, we have to help them, we have to facilitate them, we have to support them in their way to become democratic but also free market economies. And we also have the Middle East, because we can't forget, in 1995 there was still,
After Oslo.
It was just after the Oslo Accords. There was still hope, okay, now we can solve the Middle East peace process. So that was also one of the goals. We were saying, there we can work together and we can help them to broker peace. Respond to global challenges together. And global challenges there, again, were very vaguely defined. International crime. They had drug trafficking in there. Interestingly, not human trafficking, but drug trafficking, terrorism was mentioned. Environmental policy and climate change.
World Trade Center in 93, so.
But for example, climate change was mentioned as a topic at this time still. There was at the time when they started the preparation for the Kyoto Protocol. Exactly. So it was still a time where they were, okay, let's look at the challenges and work together. Another one, AIDS and Ebola. So what to do against pandemics in the end. Closer economic relations and promoting world trade. So facilitating the whole Doha negotiations in the end. What to do next in the WTO framework. And what was new is the fourth goal that they added. And then this was saying, okay, we should create closer links, not only on the political level, but we should involve business, scientists, educators. We should spread out to civil society and make sure that actually also our societies link a bit more. The way to go was, again, they just called it a systematic setup of institutional links. But what you see actually that they designed a very complex system of meeting at various levels. And that was really why this 1995 Transatlantic Agenda is actually considered to be the outline for what was happening in the transatlantic relationship afterwards in institutional terms. It set the objectives, again, quite vaguely, but at least there are 4 broad topics. And we have a very institutionalized setting. And I just wanted to show you because I based this on a research from Mark Pollack, who is in Philadelphia. And he was actually saying we can distinguish 3 levels. The intergovernmental one, the one that we see in the newspaper, when Obama is meeting the delegation of the European Union. They should have annual EU-US summits. Normally, since 1991, they actually had 2 per year because we had the rotating presidency. And each rotating presidency wanted to have the opportunity to call a US summit, of course. This cooled down on the US side. So we saw that from 2011 onwards, they made a statement that from now on we will only meet if we have the need to meet. So it was actually Anne-Marie Slaughter as the head director of the policy department and the State Department who gave this interview saying, well, what's the point to meet twice a year? We have a very fruitful transatlantic relationship, especially on the other levels. So why do we have to meet twice a year to just redefine our goals? So their argument then was like, perhaps we should just call summits when they actually want to talk about something. After this, it was also a bit of a criticism because especially when you talk to US counterparts, where they were always saying, well, for the Europeans, they considered the meeting to be the objective of the meeting. For them, it was meeting the US president was a good photo opportunity. You can go home and say, oh, I shook hand with the US president. And there was a criticism that the US gave a lot to the European counterparts saying, you know, when we meet, we have to talk about content. And perhaps we should go a bit more into detail of these vague goals that we have and actually say what are our priorities. And on the other hand, from 2011 on, what we saw on the European side was that they were saying, well, actually, perhaps the US is not interested anymore. And I think it also had a lot to do with perceptions. Because when Obama was elected, many were like, oh, he's so European in his way of behaving. He's so European the way he does politics. So he will be a good partner for Europe. And then what followed up was actually that they said, well, he didn't really actively seek a transatlantic partnership to strengthen the transatlantic partnership. So I think that was also why this disappointment grew on the European side. So we had this on the intergovernmental level. But what's actually more interesting is the transgovernmental level. And I mentioned this already earlier. Because what they emphasized was that also subnational actors should meet. So regulators, from all different kinds of policy areas that should just meet and talk of how to work together. And there we come back to what we had before with positive and negative integration. The idea not so much being of, oh, let's set up common standards of how a car has to look like to be safe in one market or the other, but they rather had the idea of saying, well, if you recognize it as safe in your entity, we will recognize it as safe too. So there was a lot of talking of how can we, in the end, get away with regulatory hurdles in our markets in order to facilitate trade. The argument there was, well, on the one hand, it helped in certain areas. We had certain areas where it worked very well, where the EU and the US were working strongly together. And just to give you an example, there was, for example, competition policy, antitrust regulation. Okay, they had different starting positions, but what many people are saying that they gradually converged. They got closer towards each other, and that helped because if you are an international company, not having two different sets of standards on both sides of the Atlantic makes an advantage. Financial services is considered as one of the areas where regulators were close in contact, and it doesn't mean that they didn't have disagreements, but the argument that Pollack is making is, well, they found a system to proactively, before this thing really blew up, look for solutions. So they really managed to get the regulators together and to assess, okay, what are the areas where we might get into conflict and how could we, in the end, prevent this conflict. And the third one is this trade and border security. There was a bit of an issue for the European Union side, at least at the beginning, especially after 9/11. But again, with this proactive approach, they managed at least to circumvent major conflicts. Interesting enough, where it didn't work so well, agricultural biotechnology. So what means GMO, food processing, and this kind of things. And again, a very strong topic that comes back now in the free trade negotiations. GMOs being a strong issue for some of the member states in the European Union. And the other thing was mutual recognition in some areas, where the thing was just, for example, the European side, the US side is always saying many decisions that the EU is taking are not based on science. Whereas in the European Union, we have the preemptive principle, which means if you can't prove that this thing is certainly not bad to be released on the market, you can't release it. So we just have different ways and different starting points of how regulators in the end allow access to the markets, and that is still a problem. The third one is the people-to-people contact. I know I can actually do it like this. And what we see there is that it largely failed. So they tried to bring together business community, consumers, environmental groups, and labor unions. And especially the last two met a couple of times but then died. Business and consumer summits were held more often, but also they had a hard time to keep the people involved interested. And the main argument that Pollack is making is, well, for them it was not the natural relationship. Because when they were looking for alliances, they did so in the global arena or on the national arena. But for them, the transatlantic relationship didn't really add a lot that would help to their mandate in the end. So that was one criticism. The second thing that Pollack says why these people-to-people contacts didn't work was also because the civil society organizations, they were meeting, discussing, but then they didn't get the opportunity to actually bring back what they had discussed to the policymakers. And that was frustrating. You meet, you come up with great ideas, but in the end, no one cares. And that was one of the arguments that Pollack says, that's why this transnational element never really managed to get up. At the same time, it was not defined in the 1995 agreement, but what we also see is that the Congress and the European Parliament developed the Transatlantic Legislators Dialogue that is still meeting today regularly, I think once per year. And the whole idea is that the two parliaments in the end talk to each other about issues that might come up. And what's quite interesting from a European perspective is because the European Parliament now got more power with the various treaties, it also has more to say. And you really see this in the last 2-3 years. There was certain legislation the Parliament either blocked, that the US wanted. SWIFT agreement, for example, was one of them. PNR agreement, passenger name record, Parliament blocked, although everyone else agreed to it, also on the European side. But we also have the other way around. For example, we had a emission trading system that was proposed by the Commission. The Congress now proposed a bill to block and say, well, our airplanes will not pay any taxes to the Europeans. Or there's, for example, the argument at the moment that some European states want to install a financial transaction tax, where Congress is also saying, yeah, not for our businesses, please. So you see that there's more and more areas that are not necessarily discussed on the high political level, but where in the end we have public policy areas that have impact on each other. And the whole idea of this transatlantic legislative dialogue is to communicate before these things in the end become a conflict. One thing that perhaps I didn't mention to the first point, the intergovernmental. What you saw with the EU-US summit was that in 1995, when this thing was set up, the Clinton administration was very pro-European integrationist. Not necessarily because they believed in European integration or something like this, but for them it was very comfortable to work with the European Union as a whole. You talk to one and not at this time 15. Okay? It's much more efficient. And at the same time, also again, Pollock shows that in the end they had common agreements anyway. So it was a smooth relationship under the Clinton administration. It got much worse in 2001 when Bush was elected. Not necessarily, on the one hand, of course, because of 9/11, and we'll talk about this a bit later, but also because the Bush administration did not necessarily see the need why in political and military terms it should talk to the European Union. But they went to what felt natural to them. They went to the member states. And in the transatlantic relationship, you really saw that in these first 6 years, there was this comprehensive approach of bringing politics, economics, and all the different elements together. But then with the US administration changing, and sometimes deliberately playing in the end with the different levels, saying, well, if you don't agree, we go to the member states. It really, again, departed these two elements of economics and politics. So that was 1995. And then 9/11 happened. And I mean, sometimes when I talk to my students, I tell them I will never forget the mood that was in Europe in 2003. Of course, there was 9/11, a very important event, of course, in the transatlantic relationship. But before 2003, there was actually something else. And it was in 2001, just after the attacks in the US, that actually the Europeans were already preparing, like, oh my God, what are we going to do if the US asks for Article 5 in NATO? So if it's common defense, how are we going to react? And there was a discussion going on, and the Europeans were waiting, and the US didn't ask. And that was really one of the elements, I think, that I wouldn't say frustrated many Europeans, but it was this realization suddenly of, oh my God, actually NATO doesn't matter. If it doesn't matter in such a case, where you're attacked on your home country, in what circumstances would you then ask for Article 5? So Article 5 is this common defense clause that if one member of the alliance is attacked, the other members will do everything in their power to support this member. And that, I think, was the first, again, mental blow to the Europeans, saying, oh my God, perhaps we are actually not needed in a transatlantic relationship when it comes to serious issues. And I think that was one of the events that is often forgotten. Everyone talks about the Iraq War, but I think this one had a very important mental impact. And then we have 2003. And I'm not sure if you remember, but 2003, Bush declares that they are going to Iraq. Declared that they are going to Iraq.
Oh.
United Kingdom under Blair decides to join and to support. And exactly, Spain, Aznar writes this letter, I think it was in the New York Times, supporting with some new member states. And then the French give this, in the United Security Council, gives this very strong speech of why France will not join them and why France thinks this is a breach of international law. Then later, first a bit more silent, but then stronger supported by Germany. So we had suddenly a disunited Europe again. the big three actually not agreeing. The UK on the side of the US versus France and Germany. And then we had some new member states that at this time were not members yet, but of course were already involved because it was clear that they will join in 2004. And most of the Eastern new member states actually joined the US-UK side. What was, of course, in Western continental Europe not perceived as something very positive as well. Saying, wow, now you're soon part of the club, and before you betray us. So there was a lot of negative energy. And many say, well, it was the Iraq War that really caused a friction in the transatlantic relationship. But I think the argument that's actually stronger to make is, well, it was not the Iraq War, it was the disunity that was shown again in the European Union. It was again, we had now slowly the common security and defense policy, things were moving together, and then Iraq happened. And it actually shows that in important elements we don't agree. And it was not only that member states disagreed, but I think it caused such a strong, such strong language as well that they used against each other, that it really destroyed the atmosphere that had been built up in a much more friendly manner beforehand. The interesting thing, on high politics, of course, media played with this idea, oh, there's friction, there's conflict. But behind the scenes, what you see is actually, they just go on with the transatlantic relationship like they did before. 2004, 2005, a bit more cautiously, very generally, but we have the institutions in place, and they meet. And just to give you some examples, I was looking at some of the summits and the other forums that they established. And they picked different topics that are probably not so contested, but nevertheless, they were working on a not so political level. In 2006, they created the Higher Education and Training Corporation, which is, for example, Fulbright paid off of this. In 2007, they created the Transatlantic Economic Council that got, again, very important. That's a working group that in the end prepared the first mandate for the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. In 2008, we have an increased cooperation in crisis management and conflict prevention, which then later on in 2011 followed in a framework agreement that, for example, civil servants of the US can participate in civilian crisis management operations of the European Union. But in the end, a very useful agreement to have and a very pragmatic one. 2010, a relaunch of the EU-US development dialogue, and in 2011, the establishment of the EU-US Energy Council. And again, if you look at some of these documents, they're very vague, they are very generally, but nevertheless, you see that there's at least the spirit to say, okay, we have to sit together and at least talk to each other and see what are the things that we want to work on together. And most of the time, I was also looking at the agreements that were signed between 2003 and 2013, and the list is approximately 11 pages long. So there were a lot of technical agreements sometimes in not so high political, sexy policy areas, but there were a lot of agreements in order to strengthen this partnership. So what we see today, I brought you a picture from 2011. And I think it very nicely summarizes of what we're talking about. As I was already saying, they don't have these regular summits now anymore since 2011, but just on special occasions. But here we had the EU Delegation, the whole delegation of the European Union, visiting Washington. And it was Obama who sat down with them for 3 hours. Then they had lunch with Joe Biden, for example. Also something that was from the European side very appreciated. Having 3 hours with the president is better than nothing. But what I find also quite interesting on this picture is, of course, as you have different representatives on the EU side, you have also different representatives on the US side. And I think that's something when Europeans talk about foreign policy making and the challenges, we also forget that states, of course, also have different departments that sometimes fight with each other. State Department versus Pentagon, state versus US aid. There are similar fights going on, but I think what's the difference is when you compare this two. Does Van Rompuy really have the same weight like Obama? And the interesting thing, that's also something that from the US side is often criticized in terms of the Lisbon Treaty, because the Lisbon Treaty was meant to make the EU stronger. And the US was very supportive at the beginning when they started to implement the change and saying, okay, we'll be a bit patient, we'll wait a year, don't worry, until you sort it out, then we'll talk again. And then the US came back and was like, oh yeah, so now you're ready, let's talk. And then they were like, oh, whom did you select? Who are these two people that you selected? Who is Ashton and who is Van Rompuy? So you saw a lot of surprise from the US side that, oh, you create these important positions and you fill it with people who might be competent but who no one knows, who don't have to put a weight. And in the end, in high politics, it's also about political weight, in the end, to fill these positions. So I thought this was a quite nice summary of how the transatlantic relationship looks like. But I think we can't forget this was only one event. And it was also from 2011. And it was at the edges of the G8 summit. And we have, for example, Van Rompuy there because he's representing the EU there, together with the Commission President. But of course, we also have the heads of states and government of the big member states. And we can't forget that, of course, also in other international organizations, they play an important representing role for the European interest and the national one. But I think it again shows quite clearly you can't separate the one from the other. But in the end, you always have to look at both. I was also looking at the last few declarations that they made, 2010 and 2011. 3 main things, and they're not really surprising. Economic growth, and I think it comes back to what we were saying, create jobs, financial stability, keep inflation under control, global challenges. And there it was quite interesting because, especially 2011, it's very detailed in what kind of conflicts are going on. It reads like a council conclusion of what has changed in the last year. We have to do something in the Arab Spring, so they mentioned Tunisia, they mentioned Egypt, they're talking about Syria, they're talking about Iran, they're talking about NATO and what the current financial crisis actually means for defense budgets. So in the end it reads again like a long list of things that happen that we should react to. Oh yeah, and we could react to it together. And then you have the third dimension, I think that becomes more and more important, what in the European context we call justice and home affairs. Security for citizens, internal security, cyber security, data protection, free internet, this kind of things. And there you again see that sometimes there's a strong, especially in data protection, there's a strong disagreement between the European way of protecting and the US way of protecting. And again, time and again it shows, most of the time then, when there's one paragraph that goes to this thing, that there are really differences. I mean, I just wanted to read you some quotes because I thought the document was quite interesting, just in terms of how it's formulated. We must intensify our efforts to realize the untapped potential of transatlantic economic cooperation. And it's always the first sentences of the paragraphs that I took. We recognize the vital role of the Energy Council. On climate change, we affirm our intent to work closely together. As the leading donors of development assistance, we reaffirm our commitment. We pledge to continue our close cooperation in the Western Balkans. And we note our continued efforts in Afghanistan and Pakistan. That's a strategic document that should guide us of where we want to cooperate. It's a lot of, okay, let's go back and look actually, of what we have done, where we have been successful. But I think here the history perspective comes in again. I sometimes also looking at this, I have very much the idea that they sit together, look back, oh, what happened in the last year? Oh, and to what should we probably react? So let's put it down. But especially from a strategic document, not every year, but sometimes I think you would need leadership in terms of saying, okay, what are the objectives that we want to achieve in the future? So that you actually select a couple of challenges that you think will be prominent in the future. And I think when you look at these documents, that is missing. There's no long-term strategy. Just for the current discourse, and I think there we can also start then discussing a bit more. Of course, since 2008 is the Eurozone, the fiscal and budgetary crisis in Europe. But at the same time, the Europeans saying, well, the US sequester, remember? It's not that your budget is really better in order. So I think this is really this new focus on economic affairs. And what I find quite interesting, I was also at a couple of discussions in Washington, and also in foreign policy, everyone is saying, well, but from now on, it's only about economics anymore. And as a political scientist, that's a bit of a scary assessment to make, because I was discussing with someone before that each economic decision has political implications, or it has a political meaning. And just to pretend that everything is about economics it sounds so technical, let's the experts decide it. But I think sometimes we should remember, well, you actually make a political statement, also with economic decisions. And the second one is, of course, this rebalancing of the US to Asia, where the US again was saying, well, it's not pivoting, it's a military strategy in the end to focus more on Asia, but it doesn't mean that we lose interest. But in the end, I think what it forces the Europeans to think about is, are we Europeans actually capable of taking care of our own security? And now in really military hard terms. It doesn't mean that in Europe really someone thinks that Russia will invade. But in terms of some disaster or a terrorist attack, do the Europeans actually have the capabilities? And I just wanted to show you from the latest NATO report, so it's the annual NATO report 2012 from the NATO members. You have, in 2007 is the blue, 2012 is the green, and each NATO member pledged to spend at least 2% of their gross domestic product. That's the red line. You see that Bulgaria was one of the countries who managed in 2007, but really dropped. France is close. Greece, but Greece we can't really count because they have lots of soldiers. They have a conflict as well. We have the US, the UK, and perhaps Turkey comes close together with Poland. But they are nowhere close to at least manage this goal that they set themselves. Some observers then say, well, yeah, but take all the European states together. Then they have a nice budget. But the problem is that there's still less coordination. So they all have the same things, but very rarely then the expert things on top that they would need. Within NATO now they've started, especially for example the Baltics, together with Poland, but also other regional cooperations started taking place in terms of smart defense, saying, okay, let's use actually our budgets together to buy, instead of 8 planes, we buy 16 and we get them cheaper. But also in terms of, okay, you get the planes, we get the tanks, and we make sure that we can work together. So there are now, already for quite some years, efforts going on in the end to make the European military strategies a bit more, more strategic and also supplementary. Another thing that's of course quite important for the European side, because it's so much lacking, is equipment. And you saw it in Libya. There were not enough transport possibilities in the end. There was not enough intelligence. And there was very strong where everyone was saying, well, NATO can work, yes, but if the US is not there to support them, there are really strategic issues missing. But of course, that's one of the discourses that's really it was already going on for quite some time. In the end, especially the US was saying, Europeans, you also have to take your fair share in military expenditure, and in the end, providing security. And then this year, you saw Libya and Mali happening. And it was quite interesting. So Libya, with establishing the no-fly zone, so the French and the British together deciding, okay, we want to establish the no-fly zone, the US saying, okay, we are going to support you. They created this notion of, oh, the US was leading from behind. There were some jokes then in Washington made like, oh, but they were not really, first of all, not from behind. And they were not really leading. They were, in the end, guiding the whole thing and making sure this whole thing works. It was then just the British and the French who implemented. But nevertheless, what I think was interesting to see was that you had 2 European states saying, okay, we at least will just push the thing now in close cooperation with the United States. And then you had Mali, where the French were negotiating quite a long time in the European framework, but couldn't get support. And sometimes, at a certain point, they said, okay, then we do it alone. Well, I think what is so interesting is that it started this discussion, okay, do we actually still need NATO necessarily in the 21st century? Because defense we don't need anymore, especially as the US showed in this one.
That's a discussion that's been going on before Libya and Mali, though, wouldn't you say?
It was especially a discussion that NATO also tried to push. We have to find a new agenda in the end. But what was interesting after Libya and Mali is that now people were really talking like, oh, perhaps we should always just have flexible coalitions. Like a bit the coalition of the willing, just more flexible. Like look around who is willing, who has the capacities, and then decide. was a very interesting, I think, development. I mean, from a European side, in terms of international law, that might have certain implications, but also in terms of having fixed coalitions in the end. And then, I mean, from the European side, the question is also, well, yeah, you have the British and the French, and if the two of them decide that they are not interested, what is happening then? What's with the rest?
They have no capacity, especially without access to NATO. NATO, the EU, has access to projection force to send troops abroad because of its agreement with NATO. So if NATO wasn't there and France and Britain weren't there, troops would have to walk from Europe anywhere they wanted to go.
Exactly.
And flexible coalitions, like most of the things, they have their advantages and disadvantages. Because how reliable would be a flexible coalition? You are here today, you are leaving tomorrow. And I would like to emphasize also that over time, you say we should not lose the historical perspective. So over time, there were enormous changes. In the 1950s and 60s, America said to Germany, if you don't pay for our troops stationed in Germany, we are going to leave. Oh, no, we are paying. And then, and the argument was in the 1970s, if the Americans would threaten, the Germans would say, go home. So these things.
But also on the other side, in the United States in the 50s, and that was a major issue, the rearmament of Germany. I mean, there were people like Dulles really pushing very strong for it and not caring about the money, the funds.
So where we stand in terms of,
Sure.
There are all kinds of alterations.
And it was also quite interesting, again with the Mali mission, the US was supporting quite a lot the French, especially with intelligence, but at some point the discussion came up if they should charge the French for it. It was something that was quickly dropped again.
The bill has arrived.
But it was really the first time that India and the US as a NATO member was saying, yeah, you can use our facilities, but, we also have scarce budget at home. What's about that? So I think that's quite interesting. So and the last topic that of course now came up in the last year is this Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. And what's interesting again, when you talk to people who observe the transatlantic relationship already for quite longer, their first reaction was like, oh, again. They were really saying, it's not the first time that we talk about this idea of creating a free trade union. But what you see at the moment is, I think because we have the budgetary crisis on both sides, people want governments to do something economically. I think it's a very good way of saying, oh, let's do something together. In the economic sphere, it's good. In the end,
Provided
that it will work.
know that it helps me. Look at France.
And at the same time, what you see on the European side, what makes it interesting, that's a trade issue. There we have clear competences. We don't have to battle now with member states who is doing what. It's the Commission who is negotiating on behalf of the member states when they gave it a mandate. I think that's quite interesting. The big debate then starts with the details. Genetically modified organisms on the European side, procurement on the US side. What about safety standards, services, which one should be included, which shouldn't be included? The French making something about their cultural heritage and film sector.
In the light of the cars.
So you quickly saw that there was 2-3 months where it was, oh yes, let's talk about a free trade agreement, and then everyone was turning around and, oh yeah, but by the way, let's not talk about this. But nevertheless, what you see at the moment, there's, I think, enough political weight to actually get this thing going. And I think also it will be tough negotiations, especially because we need the European Parliament to agree on the European side. They will start negotiating now for 18 months. That means we will have European Parliament elections in between and a new Commission. On the US side, you also need Congress, of course. Okay, so it's complex on both sides. So, of course, this thing, there's still a long way to go. At the same time, everyone keeps emphasizing if the US and the EU manage to come up with such an agreement, it will shape global trade policy. If that's then always positive for other regions is another question. But at least they're saying, well, then at least we'll be in a driving seat and not have to run behind China and other emerging powers constantly. So that's more or less the four current discourses. Any other comments from your side?
Yeah, I have a comment in terms of the budgetary crisis. There are two aspects. The one is the tax angle, but the other one is the spending. And nobody really critically goes after that. Yes, we are talking about CAP, it has to be reformed, etc., but CAP is still there. Something that cannot be changed is traveling to Strasbourg once a month through, 8 months or something like that of the year?
I think when it comes to the budgets, it's mainly the national budgets, of course, that are under constraint now. For the European budget, they had negotiated, I think they have an annual budget now, but the multi-annual financial framework was rejected by the parliament. Or I mixed them up now. One of the two was rejected. I think it was the multi-annual financial framework. And the main argument of the parliament was, well, there's not enough done for youth unemployment and social issues. So it was in the end the Commission, Council, and Member States had agreed, Commission and Member States had agreed on a new budget framework for the EU budget. But it was then the European Parliament who afterwards was saying, no, there's not enough done for social issues. And the Parliament is one of the promoters of saying, let's take a bit more money from the CAP, so the Common Agricultural Policy, and put it in social funds. Critics, on the other hand, say, well, yeah, it's having money in the social funds is nice, but we should also think of how to use the social funds. Just pouring money somewhere will not help. We need sustainable and innovative ways of promoting growth again. So I think that's the two things. At the same time with the EU budget, when you look at it, it's not that huge compared to national budgets.
But the EU budget comes from the national, they are the ones who contribute, and so whatever is channeled there is, so we really have to, it's not an abstract thing. Yeah,
that's true. The thing is, I was looking at, if you're interested in this, and when you go to the website of DG Budget, they will have clear statistics and also visualization of how much each member state pays and how much they get back. What you still see, we're still in a phase where, in the end, the Western, the old member states pay more, but they also get more back. The East pays a bit less, but they also get considerably less back, especially in agriculture policy, because they had this transitional agreements that not too much money would flow to the East. And that's, I was talking to some of my Polish colleagues, what they were saying now with the Greek crisis, or with Spain, for example, they were saying, if you look at numbers, so economic indicators, it's not that some of the Eastern member states are really doing better. They are just used to this level, because they are still catching up with the rest of the West. So really, do we want to start talking about social injustices and imbalances in Europe? Then we should actually start a bit earlier and actually still talk, how is it possible, the 10 years of the enlargement, there's actually not more progress. There's a lot of progress when you look at the economic indicators of how quickly the East caught up. You see a lot happening, but they are still far behind Greece, Spain, Cyprus, who are now considered the terrible member states.
On the other hand, you have the ECB report where Cyprus is much richer than Germany. You are familiar with that.
Mm-hmm. I have a comment about the security questions, especially in light of the Kagan piece, which is an oldie but a goodie. He seems to decisively answer the second question about Europe being able to take care of its own security in a no, but I would argue that as we discussed, global challenges become, global security, stability becomes a priority of every state. Europe doesn't have to worry about those little conflicts on its borders, that its own internal security seems rather okay. The security Europe should be worrying about is like energy security or those sorts of things, where it doesn't necessarily need the United States in a military alliance. So really the priority would be less that sort of military security and more, can Europe carry out these military actions in third countries that it wants that the United States doesn't want? I think that's shifting a bit.
And I think it's a very interesting comment as well, because what you saw, what the EU was emphasizing, especially from 2003, but also still is we are good in comprehensive security. We lack the military capacity probably, but we have the technical expertise in external assistance. And you saw it in neighborhood policy, for example. It was not only the money that they were sometimes pouring into these countries, but it was really the technical exchange that they had going on with some of these countries. The problem then again was the political level, that sometimes we were cooperating with the governments of these countries instead of probably the lower level or the civil society. But the assessment also of the Arab Spring was, well, actually Europe did a lot there, but it was very technical. It is not very sexy. You will not find it in the news. And then, I mean, when you talk to some of these people on the ground, they're actually saying, perhaps we should just be more confident in saying, yes, we don't have a big army, but it doesn't mean that we don't have an influence.
I also like the Kagan piece very much, probably the best of everything we read. He's a good writer, and I liked his perspective. But I wanted to say something briefly about Spragia, and I don't know how to pronounce her name. Is that how to pronounce it? Does anyone know?
It was Spragia.
Spragia, okay. I liked her approach. I didn't agree with some of the emphases she had, but the very sense of America's sense, the American view of our own history, sort of impeding our understanding of Europe, and maybe even our own misunderstanding of our history, which is what she portrays. And we lose track of whoever we are that she's talking about, track of the fact that we didn't forge this perfect federal union right off. It took the Civil War, and she divides American history into antebellum, bellum, and postbellum. Although that's too optimistic that we're the kind of federation that I think she might think we are. But I did like her emphasis on history. But I just have to say, she portrays Robert E. Lee as being against slavery, and that was not quite true. I just have to say this, relying on Douglas Southall Freeman, who was a very fine writer and stylist, but extraordinarily pro-Lee to the extent of being blind to Lee being slaveholder, and certainly he didn't want to break with the Union, but Virginia was his home, and Virginia had slavery, and so did he. So, but anyway, I like that historical perspective. I just thought it was sort of ironic that from her point of view, that what the United States, if we can say that, complains about is really based on almost a misunderstanding of our own history. I thought.
I mean, what I'm always wondering, because I really like the text, because I think it teaches us Europeans a lot of, why we have to think differently sometimes.
Sure, exactly.
What I'm sometimes like, so now I read this, I understand this. It's a nice analytical concept.
Yeah.
But what do I do with it now? So if you would now advise the US or the EU, so we are different. We have different setups. Should we just live with it?
But how are we going to change ourselves? But certainly getting her perspective certainly is going to be a step towards, it's not as easy to just understand that. So how do you practically apply it? I don't know, have everyone who works in the EU and on the diplomatic levels read her piece? That's probably a good start. But
I mean, and that brings me a bit to the Kagan piece, but also the Howard piece, because what I'm still wondering, as I identified these 3 stages. So we set up the framework, then we had this very pragmatic way of institutionalizing everything, and then we had the post 9/11 period, which was on a very regulatory base, was working fine, but on high politics, there was somehow not enough vision, inspiration, or whatever you want to call it. And I'm wondering what you see now. Are we still at this last stage, or do we actually see slowly that we are moving into a new stage? And I think it also goes with Kagan, when Kagan was saying, well, the Europeans they don't see the need to control things or to solve crises in the global arena. I remember we had the head of CIPRE, which is a Swedish think tank, I think, who do a lot about disarmament. And he was saying, well, what you have to understand, Europeans don't think they need military power.
right.
And it reminds me often when we have discussions in Austria, but I think the German case is similar, and perhaps you have something to say about it. We are trained not to think in terms of, we will now tell others what to do, or we will go somewhere and tell others how to do it better. I think it also has to do a lot with culture. no one can blame the US for saying, okay, let's first now look at our problems at home. And I think no one can blame the Europeans to say, okay, let's see what we can do for the financial crisis. But I think it's nevertheless to keep the attitude to say, okay, but let's nevertheless sometimes just look around and see what's actually also happening outside of our regions, but also where we actually can work together in solving certain challenges. Of course, that will also depend a lot on what external events are coming. And that brings us back to the discussion that we had earlier. Sometimes you need an external crisis to push political actors. And that, of course, can also always happen with the transatlantic relationship. And I think one of these next events that might need a decision at some point is Syria. Do we continue to ignore it, or do we actually decide that it's time to do something? So we'll see how this will play out. And I think that's interesting. And there are a lot of challenges where I can say, oh, perhaps the transatlantic relationship actually is in crisis and it will remain in crisis. But one thing I think what you always see is, well, yes, we disagree a lot. There are a lot of problems on both sides of the Atlantic. But I agree with this assessment. Well, we are still the easiest partner to work with from both perspectives. And that's something that also with the Obama administration was made very clear. Well, yeah, Europe can be a pain, especially institutional sometimes. But they are still easier to work with and to sit down with and get things done than many other countries. And I think this is also something we shouldn't forget when we analyze the transatlantic relationship.
Thank you so much.